A poor single dad took in a lost blind girl for one night, offering her shelter from a raging storm. He had no idea her father was a millionaire, and he definitely didn't expect what would happen next. The rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 angry fists as David Foster gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He'd just dropped Jamie off at his friend's house for a sleepover, and the emptiness waiting for him back at the apartment felt heavier than usual. Another Friday night alone. Another weekend of pretending everything was fine when his 7-year-old son asked why they couldn't go to the movies or get pizza like other families. He pulled into the cracked parking lot of his building, the flickering streetlight casting shadows that made the place look even more run down than it already was. The storm was getting worse. David killed the engine and made a dash for the entrance, rain soaking through his worn jacket before he even reached the door. Inside his apartment, the silence was deafening. David peeled off his wet jacket and tossed it over a chair, then stopped dead in his tracks. The kitchen table was exactly as he'd left it that morning, covered in a sea of overdue bills. Red letters screamed at him from every envelope: electric, water, rent. The mechanic shop where he worked had cut everyone's hours last month, and David was barely keeping his head above water. He slumped into the chair and picked up the electric bill. Past due. Again. His ex-wife Carmen's voice echoed in his head from their last phone call. "You can't even keep the lights on, David. How are you supposed to raise our son?" The words stung because they were true, or at least they felt true in moments like this. David rubbed his face with both hands. He'd tried so hard. After the divorce 2 years ago, he'd promised himself he'd be the father Jamie deserved. But every month was the same struggle, the same crushing weight of not being enough. He glanced at the photo. On the refrigerator, Jamie's gap-toothed smile beaming at him from last year's school picture. That kid deserved better. The storm outside intensified, thunder rattling the thin windows. David stood and walked to the kitchen, opening the near-empty fridge. A carton of milk, some leftover pasta, and a few eggs. He'd have to make it stretch until payday. He grabbed a beer, the last one from a 6-pack he'd bought 3 weeks ago, and popped it open. As he took a sip, the doorbell rang. David froze. Nobody came to visit him, especially not at 9 o'clock on a stormy Friday night. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. He set the beer down and moved toward the door, every instinct telling him this was trouble. In this neighborhood, unexpected visitors were rarely good news. Through the peephole, he saw a figure huddled against the rain. Small, young. David's hand hesitated on the deadbolt. Then he saw it. A white cane clutched in the figure's hand. He opened the door. A teenage girl stood on his doorstep, soaked to the bone. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and she wore what looked like expensive clothes, now ruined by the rain. But it was her eyes that stopped David cold. They were unfocused, gazing past him at nothing. She was blind. "Please," she said, her voice shaking from cold or fear or both. "I'm lost. I need help." David's first thought was to close the door. He didn't know this girl. This could be some kind of scam, a setup. But then she shivered violently, and he saw how young she really was. 15, maybe 16 at most. "What are you doing out here?" David asked, still blocking the doorway. "I got separated from my group," she said quickly. "There was a charity event downtown. I went to use the restroom, and when I came out, everyone was gone. I tried to call, but my phone died, and I've been walking for hours and nobody would answer their door." Her words tumbled out in a rush. "Please, I just need to wait out the storm. I won't be any trouble." David looked past her, into the rain-soaked street. No car, no group of concerned adults searching for a missing blind girl. Just empty sidewalks and the relentless storm. Something didn't add up, but leaving her out here wasn't an option either. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The girl practically stumbled through the doorway, water dripping onto his floor. She stood there, uncertain, her cane tapping lightly as she oriented herself. "Bathroom's the first door on your right," David said. "I'll get you a towel." He moved past her to the tiny linen closet and grabbed the only decent towel he had, trying not to think about how threadbare it looked. When he returned, the girl had found her way to the bathroom door, her cane sweeping in practiced arcs. "Here," David said, and she turned toward his voice. He placed the towel in her outstretched hand. "Thank you," she said softly. I'm Ella, by the way. David. She disappeared into the bathroom, and David stood in his hallway, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. He went to the kitchen and put on water for tea, something his mother used to do whenever someone needed comfort. As he waited for the kettle to boil, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Ella's story. The clothes she wore, what he could see of them beneath the rain damage, looked expensive. Designer, maybe. Her shoes were leather, the kind that cost more than David made in a week, and she was alone in one of the roughest neighborhoods in the city. What charity event would bring someone like her here? The bathroom door opened and Ella emerged, still damp but no longer dripping. She'd done her best to dry her hair with the towel, which now hung around her shoulders. The kitchen's straight ahead, about 10 steps. David said, "There's a chair at the table." Ella moved forward with surprising confidence, her cane barely touching the ground. She reached the table and sat down with practiced ease. David poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her, guiding her hand to the handle. "It's hot," he warned. "Thank you." She wrapped both hands around the cup, as if trying to absorb its warmth. "I'm sorry to intrude like this. You must think I'm crazy." "I think you're wet and lost," David said, sitting across from her. "The storm should pass in a couple hours. Do you have someone I can call? Parents? The people from your event?" Ella's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "My phone's dead, and I don't have anyone's number memorized except my father's. But he's—" She paused. "He's out of town. Business trip. He won't be back until tomorrow morning." Another piece that didn't quite fit. David studied her face, looking for signs of deception, but her unseeing eyes gave nothing away. "What about the charity event organizers? They must be looking for you." "I'm sure they are," Ella said quietly, "but I don't know how to reach them. I'm new to the city. We just moved here a few months ago." The kettle whistled again, breaking the tension. David got up to turn it off, using the moment to think. Every instinct screamed that Ella wasn't telling him the whole truth, but what was he supposed to do? Throw her back out into the storm? "Where do you live?" he asked, returning to the table. "Maybe I can drive you home once the weather clears." "North Hills," she said, naming one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the city. David's suspicion crystallized into certainty. North Hills was 45 minutes away in good weather. What was a blind girl from North Hills doing at a charity event in his neighborhood? And why hadn't anyone come looking for her? "That's pretty far," he said carefully. "Your father must be worried. I told you he's out of town." Ella's voice had an edge now, defensive. "Look, I know this is weird. I know you're probably thinking I'm lying or trying to scam you or something. But I'm not. I just got lost and scared. And you were the first person who actually opened their door." Her hands trembled slightly around the teacup. "If you want me to leave, I'll leave." David felt a pang of guilt. She was just a kid, blind and alone in a storm. Whatever secrets she was keeping, she clearly needed help. "You can stay," he said, "at least until the storm passes." The tension in Ella's shoulders eased. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain drumming steadily on the roof. David found himself studying her again, this time with something closer to curiosity than suspicion. Despite everything, despite the expensive clothes and the implausible story, there was something genuine about her fear. "So," David said, trying to lighten the mood, "what kind of charity event was it?" Ella hesitated, then seemed to decide it was safe to answer. "Something for the hospital. Pediatric wing fundraiser. My father's company was one of the sponsors." "Your father has a company?" "He's in business." Ella's tone made it clear she didn't want to. "Elaborate." David let it drop. Instead, he found himself talking, filling the awkward silence with words he hadn't planned to say. "I have a son, Jamie. He's 7. He's at a sleepover tonight." "That must be nice," Ella said. "Having someone." The sadness in her voice surprised him. "You don't have siblings?" "No. It's just me and my father. And he's always working." She said it matter-of-factly, but David heard the loneliness underneath. "I work a lot too," David admitted. "Not by choice, really. I'm a mechanic. The shop keeps cutting our hours, but I can't afford to look for something else because I need the health insurance for Jamie." He stopped, wondering why he was telling a stranger all this. "His mother and I are divorced. She thinks I'm a failure." "Are you?" Ella asked, her blind eyes somehow finding his direction across the table. The question caught him off guard. I don't know. Some days it feels like it. I can't give him the things other kids have. Can't take him places. Can't even keep up with the bills half the time. David stared into his tea. I wanted to be so much more than this. What did you want to be? A father Jamie could be proud of. The words came out raw, more honest than David had intended. Someone who could give him opportunities, you know, a better life than I had. Ella was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. My father gives me everything. Money, private schools, the best doctors, everything except himself. She turned her face toward the window, toward the sound of rain. Sometimes I think I'd trade it all just to have dinner with him once a week without him checking his phone every 5 minutes. David felt something shift in his chest. Here was this girl from a world he couldn't even imagine, and she was just as lonely as he was, maybe more. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be. At least you care enough to feel like a failure. That's more than some parents can say. They talked through the storm. Ella asked about Jamie, what he liked, what made him laugh. David found himself describing his son's obsession with dinosaurs, the way he narrated his entire day at school without taking a breath, how he still insisted on David checking under the bed for monsters, even though he was way too old for that stuff. And in talking about Jamie, David remembered why he kept pushing through the hard days. Ella listened with an intensity that made David wonder what she was really hearing in his words. Eventually, she began to share too, carefully, bits and pieces about her life. The tutors instead of real school, the driver who took her everywhere, the massive house that felt empty even with a dozen people working there. You know what I miss most? Ella said suddenly. Being normal. Just being a regular kid who can walk to a friend's house or go to the store by myself. I know I can't see, but that's not what stops me. It's everyone else thinking I'm too fragile, too delicate, too much of a liability. Is that why you didn't call anyone tonight? David asked. Why you knocked on a stranger's door instead? Ella's smile was sad. Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted one night where someone saw me as a person instead of a problem to be solved. David understood that better than he wanted to admit. By the time midnight rolled around, the storm had softened to a steady drizzle. Ella was yawning despite her efforts to hide it, and David realized she probably hadn't slept in hours. You should rest, he said. You can take my bed. I'll sleep on the couch. I couldn't. It's fine. Jamie's room is tiny, and you're not sleeping on this couch. Trust me. The springs gave out 2 years ago. David stood, already heading toward his bedroom. Come on. He led her to the room, acutely aware of how messy it was. Clothes on the floor, unmade bed, that pile of self-help books he'd bought when Carmen first left and never read. Ella wouldn't see any of it, but somehow that made him more embarrassed. Bed straight ahead, about 6 steps. David said, Bathroom's across the hall if you need it. Thank you, David. Really. Ella made her way to the bed and sat down. You didn't have to help me. Yeah, I did, David said, and he meant it. He closed the door and returned to the living room, grabbing a thin blanket from the closet. The couch was as uncomfortable as promised, but David had slept on worse. As he lay there, staring at the water-stained ceiling, he couldn't stop thinking about everything Ella had said, about loneliness and failure and wanting to be seen. Tomorrow he'd drive her home, and this strange night would become just another odd memory. But for now, for a few hours, David didn't feel quite so alone. And maybe, he thought, neither did she. Outside, the rain finally stopped, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the distant rumble of retreating thunder. If you're enjoying the story so far, please hit that like button, share this with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales like this. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in David's shoes, facing a stranger at your door in the middle of a storm? Let's keep the conversation going. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, waking David from a restless sleep. His neck ached from the awkward angle of the couch, and for a moment, he forgot why he wasn't in his own bed. Then he heard movement from the bedroom, the soft tap of a cane against the floor, and everything came rushing back. Ella. David sat up, running a hand through his hair. What was he supposed to do now? Drive her home like he'd promised, Hand her off to whoever answered the door, and pretend this whole strange night never happened. Something about that felt wrong, incomplete somehow. The bedroom door opened, and Ella emerged, looking more composed than she had any right to after sleeping in a stranger's apartment. Her hair was pulled back, and she'd somehow managed to smooth out most of the wrinkles in her clothes. "Morning," David said, his voice rough from sleep. "Good morning." Ella turned toward his voice. "I hope I didn't wake you. I tried to be quiet." "You're fine. I was already up." A lie, but a harmless one. David stood, folding the blanket he'd used. "Are you hungry?" "I don't have much, but I can make eggs." "You don't have to." "Ella, you've said that about a dozen times since you got here. Let me make you breakfast." David moved to the kitchen, pulling out the eggs and the last of the bread. "Besides, I'm making some for myself anyway." He heard her make her way to the table, that same confident navigation she'd shown last night. As David cracked eggs into a pan, he found himself watching her from the corner of his eye. In the daylight, the contrast between her and his shabby apartment was even more stark. Everything about her screamed money, from the cut of her clothes to the way she carried herself. "Your home is nice," Ella said suddenly. David nearly laughed. "You don't have to be polite. I know what this place looks like." "I meant, it feels lived in, real." Ella's fingers traced the edge of the table. "Our house is beautiful, but it's like a museum. Everything's perfect and cold and you're not supposed to touch anything." David plated the eggs and toast, setting one in front of Ella and guiding her hand to the fork. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness of the previous night mostly gone. "So," David said eventually, "I should probably get you home. Your father must be back by now, and I'm sure he's worried." Ella's expression closed off immediately. "Right. Of course. Unless you want to tell me what's really going on." David kept his tone gentle, non-accusatory. "Because I'm having a hard time believing a blind teenager from North Hills just accidentally wandered into my neighborhood in the middle of a storm." Ella set down her fork. For a long moment, she didn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I ran away." David's stomach dropped. "What?" "Not permanently, just for a night. I wanted." She struggled to find the words. "I wanted to feel normal, to go somewhere my father's money and reputation didn't matter, where people didn't know who I was." "Who are you?" David asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "It doesn't matter." "That's the whole point." Ella's hands clenched in her lap. "Every single person I meet, they either pity me because I'm blind or they want something from my father. I've never had a real conversation with someone who just saw me as Ella, just a person." David thought about their talk last night, how genuine it had felt. "So you lied to me?" "No. I got lost. That part was true. I took a taxi to a different part of the city because I wanted to walk around without my security detail following me. But then the storm came and my phone died. And I actually was scared." Ella's voice cracked slightly. "And when you opened the door, when you talked to me like I was just a regular person who needed help, I didn't want to ruin it by telling you who my father is." "Who is your father, Ella?" She was quiet for so long David thought she might not answer. Then, almost inaudibly, she said, "Thomas Calloway." The name hit David like a physical blow. Thomas Calloway. The Thomas Calloway, CEO of Calloway Enterprises, one of the biggest conglomerates in the state. The man's face was on billboards, in newspapers, everywhere. He was worth hundreds of millions, maybe more. "Jesus," David breathed. "See, this is exactly what I wanted to avoid." Ella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Now you're going to treat me differently. Now I'm not just Ella anymore. I'm Thomas Calloway's daughter, and everything changes." "That's not," David started, but she was right. Everything had changed. The wealthy neighborhood suddenly made sense. The expensive clothes, the vague references to her father's business. And now David understood the real risk she'd taken, wandering alone in his neighborhood. If something had happened to her, if the wrong person had found her. "I should take you home," David said quietly. Ella's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yeah, okay." They drove in tense silence, David's old Honda feeling even more decrepit than usual. Every rattle and squeak seemed amplified, a constant reminder of the gulf between his world and Ella's. He kept glancing at her in the passenger seat, trying to reconcile the lonely girl from last night with the heiress sitting beside him now. "Turn left at the next light," Ella said, her voice flat. David followed her directions, watching as the neighborhoods gradually transformed from rundown to working class to affluent. The houses got bigger, the lawns more manicured. By the time they reached North Hills, David felt like he was in a different city entirely. "It's the one with the iron gates," Ella said. "You can't miss it." She wasn't wrong. The estate rose up before them like something from a movie, massive and imposing behind ornate gates. David pulled up to the intercom, his hands sweating on the steering wheel. "This is a mistake," Ella said suddenly. "What?" "Taking me back. It's a mistake. Nothing's going to change. My father's going to yell at me for disappearing. Then he'll hire more security, and I'll be even more trapped than before." Her voice was rising, panic creeping in. "And you're going to drive away and forget all about this, and I'll never have another real conversation with anyone ever again." David didn't know what to say. What could he say? That everything would be fine? They both knew that was a lie. Before he could respond, the gates began to swing open. Someone had seen them on the security cameras. There was no turning back now. David drove up the long driveway, his heart pounding. The house, if you could even call it, here's Lou. That was enormous. 3 stories of pristine white stone, with columns and windows that probably cost more than David's entire apartment building. He parked near the front entrance, feeling completely out of place. "I'm sorry," Ella said, "for lying, for putting you in this position." "Don't be sorry. I'm glad you knocked on my door." David meant it. Despite everything, despite the complications and the lies, he was glad he'd helped her. The front door opened, and a man stepped out. Thomas Calloway, in person, was even more imposing than his photograph suggested. Tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair and a perfectly tailored suit despite the early hour. His face was a mask of controlled fury. "Stay in the car," David said to Ella, but she was already opening her door. "Ella!" Thomas's voice boomed across the driveway. "Where the hell have you been?" David got out quickly, positioning himself slightly in front of Ella. It was instinctive, protective, even though he knew it was. Ridiculous. What was he going to do? Defend her from her own father? "Mr. Calloway," David started, but Thomas cut him off with a gesture. "Who are you?" Thomas's eyes were cold, assessing. "Where did you find my daughter?" "Dad, stop." Ella's voice was surprisingly steady. "His name is David Foster. I got lost in the storm last night and he gave me shelter. He didn't know who I was. He was just being kind." Thomas's expression didn't soften. He looked David up and down, taking in the worn jeans, the old jacket, the car that was probably held together by rust and prayers. David could practically see the calculations happening behind those cold eyes. "I see." Thomas's tone suggested he saw quite a bit. "And you're just returning her now, at 9 in the morning?" The implication was clear, and it made David's blood boil. "She slept in my bed. I took the couch. Nothing happened except I gave a scared kid a safe place to wait out the storm. A scared kid who happens to be worth a substantial ransom." "Dad!" Ella's face flushed with anger. "He didn't know who I was. He didn't ask for anything. He was the only person who treated me like a human being instead of a walking dollar sign, which is apparently more than I can expect from my own father." The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond to Ella. Instead, he turned his attention back to David. "I'd like to speak with you privately, Mr. Foster." "Ella, go inside." "No, whatever you're going to say, you can say it in front of me. Now, Ella." For a moment, David thought she might refuse, but then her shoulders sagged and she turned toward the house, her cane tapping a defeated rhythm on the stone path. She paused at the door, looking back in their direction even though she couldn't see them. "Thank you, David," she said quietly, "for everything." Then she was gone, the door closing behind her, with a finality that made David's chest ache. Thomas waited until she was inside before speaking. "How much do you want?" "Excuse me?" "How much money will it take to keep you quiet about this? About finding Ella? About where she was? About whatever she might have told you?" Thomas pulled out a checkbook. "Name your price." David felt like he'd been slapped. "I don't want your money." Everyone wants money, Mr. Foster. The only question is how much. Thomas's pen was already moving across the check. 10,000? 20? I'm prepared to be generous given the circumstances. I said I don't want your money. David's voice was harder now, angry. I helped your daughter because she needed help. That's it. There's no price, no angle, no scheme. Thomas looked up, and for the first time, there was something other than cold calculation in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. Then what do you want? Everyone wants something. David thought about the bills on his kitchen table, the overdue rent, Jamie's school expenses, the 1,000 things that money could fix. In his life, it would be so easy to take whatever Thomas was offering. No one would blame him. But then he thought about Ella's face when she talked about people only seeing her father's money, about how desperately she wanted to be seen as just a person. Taking Thomas's payoff would prove her right, prove that everyone had a price. I want you to talk to your daughter, David said. Really talk to her, not at her, not around her. She's lonely and scared, and she ran away because she'd rather take her chances alone in a storm than spend another night in that house feeling invisible. Thomas's expression hardened. You have no right. You're right. I don't. But I spent 3 hours talking to Ella last night, which is apparently 3 hours more than you've managed lately. David knew he was crossing a line, knew he should shut up, but the words kept coming. She told me about the tutors and the drivers and the security detail, about how she can't remember the last time you had dinner together without you checking your phone. She said you give her everything except yourself. How dare you? I'm a terrible father, David interrupted. I'm broke. I'm struggling. I can barely keep the lights on. But my son knows I love him. He knows that when I'm with him, he has my full attention. Can Ella say the same? The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas's face had gone pale, his hands clenched at his sides. For a moment, David thought he might actually throw a punch, and honestly, David wasn't sure he'd blame him. But then Thomas's shoulders sagged, just slightly, and David saw something crack in that perfect, controlled facade. Get out, Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. Mr. Calloway, get out. Stronger this time, but still not quite right. Leave my property before I have you arrested for trespassing. David knew a dismissal when he heard one. He got in his car, hands shaking with adrenaline. As he pulled away, he caught a glimpse of Thomas in the rearview mirror, still standing in the driveway, staring at nothing. The drive home felt longer than it should have. David's mind kept replaying the conversation, wondering if he'd just made a huge mistake. Who was he to lecture a billionaire about parenting? Thomas Calloway could destroy him with a phone call, could make his already difficult life infinitely worse. But when David thought about Ella, about the sadness in her voice when she talked about her father, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He made it back to his apartment and sat in the car for a long moment, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. A blind girl knocking on his door in a storm. Hours of honest conversation. The revelation of who she really was. The confrontation with one of the most powerful men in the city. It felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. David's phone buzzed. A text from Carmen. Don't forget, Jamie's school project is due Monday. He says you promised to help. Reality came crashing back. Bills to pay, a son to pick up from his sleepover, a life to keep struggling through. The strange interlude with Ella was over, and nothing had really changed. Except maybe it had, because as David climbed the stairs to his apartment, as he looked at those same overdue bills on the kitchen table, he felt something different. Not hope, exactly, but not quite despair either. He'd helped someone who needed it. He'd stood up to a man who tried to buy his silence. He'd been honest and kind and decent, even when it might have cost him. Maybe, David thought, that was enough. Maybe that's what being a good father really meant, showing Jamie through actions that some things matter more than money. His phone rang. Unknown number. David almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Foster? An unfamiliar woman's voice. This is Linda Chen, executive assistant to Thomas Calloway. Mr. Calloway would like to schedule a meeting with you tomorrow at 2 p.m., if you're available. David's heart stopped. A meeting about what? Mr. Calloway didn't specify. He simply asked me to arrange it. Should I put you down for 2 o'clock? David's mind raced. This could be anything. A threat, legal action, or maybe, just maybe, something else entirely. Yeah, David heard himself say. 2 o'clock works. Excellent. I'll send you the address. Good day, Mr. Foster. The line went dead. David sat down heavily at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. What had he just agreed to? What did Thomas Calloway want with him? He had 24 hours to find out, and he had absolutely no idea what to expect. Before you continue, what do you think would happen next? Will David be able to trust Ella's story, or will the truth about her identity shake him to his core? Drop your predictions in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with others. There's more to come. David spent the next 24 hours second-guessing everything. He picked Jamie up from his sleepover, trying to act normal while his mind spun with possibilities. What did Thomas Calloway want? Was this some kind of trap? Should he bring a lawyer he couldn't afford? Jamie chattered about his weekend, oblivious to his father's distraction. They built a volcano for the school project using baking soda and vinegar, and for a few hours, David managed to forget about the looming meeting. But as soon as Jamie went to bed, the anxiety came roaring back. Monday afternoon arrived too quickly. David stood in front of his closet, staring at clothes that suddenly seemed impossibly shabby. He settled on his only dress shirt, the one he wore to job interviews and parent-teacher conferences, and a pair of jeans that didn't have any visible stains. The address Linda Chen had sent led him to Calloway Enterprises headquarters, a gleaming tower of steel and glass in the business district. David felt like an imposter the moment he walked through the revolving doors. Everyone in the lobby wore expensive suits and moved with purpose. He was just a mechanic in a cheap shirt, completely out of his depth. Mr. Foster, a woman in her 40s, approached, her smile professional and warm. I'm Linda Chen. Mr. Calloway is expecting you. She led him to a private elevator that required a key card to access. They rode up in silence, David's reflection in the polished doors showing him exactly how out of place he was. The elevator opened directly into a penthouse office suite, and Linda gestured toward a set of double doors. Go right in. David's hand trembled slightly as he pushed open the door. The office was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Thomas Calloway stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, staring out at the skyline. Mr. Foster, thank you for coming. Thomas turned, and David was surprised to see that he looked tired, not quite as controlled as he had been yesterday. Please, sit. David sat in one of the leather chairs facing the desk, feeling like he was about to be sentenced. Thomas moved to his own chair but didn't sit immediately. Instead, he picked up a folder from his desk and held it for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. I had you investigated, Thomas said bluntly. I hope you'll understand why. David's stomach dropped. Of course you did. David Foster, 35 years old. Divorced father of one. Works as a mechanic at Patterson's Auto. Behind on rent by 3 months. Significant credit card debt. No criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Thomas set the folder down. Coached your son's little league team last summer even though the position was volunteer. Helped your elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs every week until she moved to assisted living. David didn't know what to say. Having his life reduced to a file folder felt invasive and humiliating. I also spoke with Ella, Thomas continued, at length, about what happened Friday night, about what you talked about what you said to me. He paused. She told me I'm a terrible father. Mr. Calloway, she's right. The words came out flat, matter of fact. Thomas finally sat down, and suddenly he looked older than his 50-something years. My wife died when Ella was 6. Cancer. It was fast and brutal, and it destroyed me. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense, the only thing I could control. And somewhere along the way, I stopped being a father and became just a provider. David didn't speak. This wasn't what he'd expected. Ella lost her sight in a car accident 3 years ago. We were driving home from one of her piano recitals. A drunk driver ran a red light. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. She was in the hospital for 2 months. I sat by her bed every day, watching her learn to navigate a world she could no longer see, and I promised myself I'd protect her from everything, every danger. every pain, every disappointment. But you ended up protecting her from life, David said quietly. Yes. Thomas met his eyes. You were right. About all of it. I've been so focused on keeping her safe that I forgot she needed more than safety. She needed a father who was actually present. Why are you telling me this? Thomas leaned back in his chair. Because Ella came home Friday night, and for the first time in years, she seemed happy, really happy. She told me about your son, about your struggles, about how you talked to her like she was just a person. She said you made her feel normal. He paused. And then you stood in my driveway and told me things no one else has had the courage to say. You didn't want my money. You just wanted me to be better. David shifted uncomfortably. I was out of line. You were honest. There's a difference. Thomas opened a drawer and pulled out a business card. We want to offer you a position at Callaway Enterprises. Nothing extravagant, not yet, but we're opening a new automotive division, luxury vehicle maintenance and restoration. I need someone to head the technical side, someone who understands cars and can build a team. The salary is $85,000 to start, full benefits, and we'd help you relocate to a better neighborhood. David's mouth went dry. $85,000. That was more than double what he made now. It was enough to catch up on bills, to give Jamie the life he deserved, to stop drowning. Why? David managed to ask. Because you're exactly the kind of person I want working for me. Someone with integrity, someone who does the right thing even when it's hard. Thomas slid the business card across the desk. And because Ella asked me to. She said you deserve a chance, the same way you gave her one. David picked up the card, his hands shaking. This was everything he'd been struggling for, handed to him on a silver platter. But something nagged at him, a whisper of doubt. Is this charity? David asked. Because I meant what I said. I don't want. This is business, Mr. Foster. I wouldn't offer you this position if I didn't think you could excel at it. Your work record speaks for itself. 12 years at Patterson's Auto, never missed a day. Highest customer satisfaction ratings on staff. Thomas smiled slightly. I do my research, but I won't lie and say Ella's request didn't factor into my decision. She cares about you, in whatever way someone can care about a person they've known for one night. And I've learned to listen when my daughter tells me something matters. David stared at the card. Linda Chen's contact information. A start date, 3 weeks away. A salary that would change everything. I need to think about it, David heard himself say. Thomas nodded. I expected you'd say that. Take your time. The offer stands for 2 weeks. David stood to leave, then paused at the door. How is she? Ella? Angry at me. Hopeful. Scared that things won't really change. Thomas's expression softened. We had breakfast together this morning. No phones, no interruptions. It was the first time in months. So I suppose we're making progress. Good. That's good. David made it to his car before the emotion hit him. He sat in the parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel, and let himself feel everything he'd been holding back. Relief, fear, hope, disbelief. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him, but it was real. The business card in his pocket proved it. David drove to pick up Jamie from school, his mind racing with possibilities. A new job, a better apartment, the ability to take Jamie to movies and restaurants without counting pennies. He could be the father he'd always wanted to be. Jamie climbed into the car, his backpack nearly as big as he was. Dad, guess what? I got an A on my volcano project. Mrs. Patterson said it was the best one. In the class. That's amazing, buddy. David pulled into traffic, glancing at his son in the rearview mirror. Jamie's gap-toothed grin was infectious. I'm really proud of you. Can we get ice cream to celebrate? David thought about the $23 in his wallet. Under normal circumstances, he'd have to say no. They needed that money for groceries. But today wasn't normal. Yeah, David said. We can get ice cream. They went to Jamie's favorite place, a small shop near their apartment. David ordered 2 scoops for Jamie and 1 for himself, wincing internally at the total but refusing to let it show on his face. They sat at a sticky table by the window, and Jamie told him everything about his day, barely pausing to breathe between sentences. This, David thought, this was what mattered. Not the job offer, or the money, or the chance to impress his ex-wife. Just this moment, sharing ice cream with his son, being fully present. "Dad," Jamie said suddenly, "are you okay? You seem weird." "Just thinking." "About what?" David considered how to answer. He hadn't told Jamie about the job offer yet. Hadn't told anyone. Part of him worried that talking about it might make it disappear, like waking from a dream. "About how lucky I am," David said. "To have you." Jamie rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. "You're being mushy again." "Yeah, I am." "Deal with it." That night, after Jamie was asleep, David sat at his kitchen table and really looked at the business card. He pulled out his laptop and researched Callaway Enterprises' automotive division. It was legitimate, not just some make-work position created out of pity. They were planning a network of high-end service centers, competing with the dealer monopolies. It was ambitious and risky, and exactly the kind of challenge David had stopped letting himself dream about. He thought about what accepting would mean, moving Jamie to a new school, leaving Patterson's Auto after 12 years, stepping into a world where he'd be surrounded by people with degrees and connections and family money. Could he really do this? His phone rang. Carmen's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," David answered. "I heard you took Jamie for ice cream." Carmen's tone was accusatory. "I thought you said money was tight." "It is, but he got an A on his project. I wanted to celebrate. By spending money you don't have." David felt his jaw tighten. "It was $10, Carmen. $10 you could have put toward the child support you're behind on." And there it was. The constant reminder that he wasn't enough, wasn't doing enough, wasn't good enough. David almost told her about the job offer, just to prove he wasn't the failure she thought he was. But something stopped him. "I'll figure it out," David said. "I always do. That's what worries me." Carmen sighed. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult. I just want what's best for Jamie." "So do I. That's all I've ever wanted." After they hung up, David pulled out the business card again. He could prove Carmen wrong. He could show her that he was capable of providing, of being more than just a struggling mechanic. He could give Jamie everything. But was that really why he wanted the job? David thought about Ella, about how she'd run away from a mansion and ended up on his doorstep looking for something money couldn't buy. He thought about Thomas Callaway, surrounded by wealth and power but unable to connect with his own daughter. He thought about that breakfast they'd shared. No phones, no interruptions, and how it had been a victory in itself. Money wasn't the answer to everything. David had always known that intellectually. But sitting in his worn-down apartment, surrounded by bills and evidence of his struggles, it was easy to forget. The next morning, David called the number on the business card. Linda Chen speaking. "Miss Chen, this is David Foster. I'd like to accept Mr. Callaway's offer." There was a smile in her voice. "Wonderful. I'll have the paperwork sent over. Can you start 3 weeks from today?" "Yes. And Miss Chen, could you tell Mr. Callaway something for me?" "Of course. Tell him thank you. Not just for the job, for listening." "I will, Mr. Foster." David hung up and sat in the silence of his apartment. He'd done it. He'd said, yes, in 3 weeks, everything would change. But first he had something else to do. That afternoon, David drove back to North Hills. He didn't call ahead, didn't make an appointment. He just showed up at the gates and pressed the intercom button. Can I help you?" A security guard's voice crackled through the speaker. "David Foster to see Ella Callaway. She's expecting me." Another lie, but a small one. There was a pause, probably while the guard checked with someone. Then the gates swung open. Thomas answered the door himself, surprise flickering across his face. "Mr. Foster, I didn't realize you were coming. I'm sorry for not calling. I wanted to thank Ella for what she said to you about me deserving a chance." Thomas stepped aside. "She's in the music room, second door on the left." David found Ella sitting at a grand piano, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced confidence. She was playing something classical and beautiful, a melody that filled the massive room with warmth. She stopped when she heard his footsteps. "David," her face lit up with genuine joy. "What are you doing here?" "I came to say thank you, and to tell you that I took the job. I start in 3 weeks." Ella stood, moving toward his voice with that same confident navigation. "I'm so glad. I was worried you might say no. I almost did. I kept thinking it was too good to be true, that I didn't deserve it. But you do deserve it. You helped me when you didn't have to. You were kind when you had every reason not to be." Ella's smile was sad. "That's rare, David. Rarer than you think. How are things with your dad?" "Better. Not perfect, but better. He's actually been eating dinner with me every night. We talk about real things now, not just surface stuff." She paused. "He told me about his conversation with you, about my mom and the accident. He's never talked to me about that before. I think you opened something in him that he'd kept locked away." David felt his throat tighten. "I'm glad." "Me too." Ella reached out, and David took her hand. "Will you bring Jamie to visit sometime? I'd like to meet him." "Yeah, I think he'd like that." They talked for another hour about Jamie and music and the future. Thomas joined them eventually, and the three of them sat in that beautiful room as the afternoon light faded. It felt comfortable, natural, like maybe they could actually be friends beyond the strange circumstances that had brought them together. When David finally left, Thomas walked him to his car. "I meant what I said," Thomas told him, "about you being the kind of person I want working for me. But I want you to know it goes beyond that. Ella hasn't been this happy in years. Whatever you did, whatever you said to her that night, it made a difference. So thank you." "I just listened," David said. "Sometimes that's all people need. Sometimes that's everything." David drove home as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. His phone buzzed with a text from Jamie. "When are you coming home? I'm hungry." He smiled and texted back, "On my way, buddy. How about we order pizza tonight?" "Really? Really?" At a red light, David caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked the same as always, tired and a little worn down. But something in his eyes was different. Hopeful, maybe, or just less defeated. 3 weeks later, David started his new job. The first day was overwhelming, surrounded by people in expensive suits discussing profit margins and market analyses. But when they got to the technical discussions, when they started talking about engines and systems and the actual work of maintaining vehicles, David found his footing. This was his world. He belonged here. His new apartment was in a better neighborhood, with a school system that Jamie loved. They could afford groceries without counting pennies. David paid off his debt. He even bought Jamie a bike for his birthday, the expensive kind with all the gears that his son had been wanting for months. But the best part, the part that mattered most, was the time. David wasn't working double shifts anymore. He made it to Jamie's soccer games. They had dinner together every night. He could be present in a way he'd never been able to before. Carmen noticed the changes. The child support came on time, Jamie's new clothes and toys, the different address. She called one evening, curiosity finally overwhelming her pride. "What happened?" she asked. "Did you win the lottery?" "Something like that," David said. He'd never told her about Ella, about that stormy night or the chain of events it had set in motion. It didn't feel right to share, somehow. That night belonged to him and Ella and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Well, whatever it is, keep it up. Jamie's happier than I've seen him in years. That meant more than Carmen probably realized. Months passed. David proved himself at Callaway Enterprises, building a team and developing systems that impressed even the skeptical board members. Thomas became something more than a boss, closer to a mentor. They had lunch once a week, discussing business and family in equal measure. Ella visited David's apartment sometimes, usually with her father. She and Jamie hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of terrible jokes and video games. Watching them together, David was reminded that loneliness didn't discriminate. Rich or poor, sighted or blind, everyone needed connection. One evening, almost a year after that stormy night, Thomas and Ella came over for dinner. It was nothing fancy, just spaghetti and salad. But they sat around David's modest table and talked and laughed like family. After Jamie went to bed, the three adults lingered over coffee. Thomas raised his mug in a toast to David Foster, who opened his door to a stranger in a storm and changed 3 lives in the process. 4 lives, Ella corrected. Don't forget Jamie. David felt emotion welling up. I was just doing what anyone would do. But most people don't. Thomas said quietly. Most people would have closed the door, made excuses, looked the other way. You didn't, and that made all the difference. Later, after Thomas and Ella had left, David stood in his apartment and looked around. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fancy, but it was home, filled with the evidence of a life well lived. Jamie's drawings on the fridge, the photo of them at the beach last summer, the comfortable couch they'd picked out together. David thought about the man he'd been a year ago, drowning in bills and self-doubt, convinced he was failing at the only thing that really mattered. He'd been so focused on what he couldn't provide that he'd lost sight of what he could. His phone buzzed. A text from Ella. "Thank you again for tonight. You guys are the closest thing I have to a real family." David's throat tightened as he typed back. "Your family to us too. Always will be." He stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, a year ago, a scared blind girl had knocked on a stranger's door in a storm. And that stranger, a poor single dad who thought he had nothing to offer, had opened it. Sometimes, David thought, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest ripples. Sometimes opening your door, opening your heart, is all it takes to change everything. His reflection in the window showed a man transformed, not by money or success, but by the simple act of being present, of choosing compassion over convenience, of believing that everyone deserves to be seen. David smiled and turned away from the window. Tomorrow he had work, and Jamie had school, and life would continue with all its beautiful, messy complications. But tonight, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. He was enough. He had always been enough. He just needed a stormy night and a lost girl to help him see it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Story for more inspiring tales. Leave a comment below telling us what act of kindness changed your life, and hit that like button to help us share more stories that matter. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply open the door